The town square is unusually busy. A young woman accidentally bumps into a wealthy merchant while carrying a basket of supplies. The basket falls, bread rolls across the dirt, the merchant publicly humiliates her. "Watch where you're going." She kneels to gather the bread, no one helps, no one speaks, then. A calm voice cuts through the silence. Caleb steps forward, looks directly at the merchant, and quietly says, "That's no way to treat a lady." The entire street goes silent. The merchant laughs. But Caleb never backs down. The dusty streets of Willow Creek had seen arguments before. Ranch hands settled disputes with stubborn words, merchants bargained louder than necessary, and travelers often carried tempers as heavy as their saddlebags. But on this particular afternoon, the entire town seemed to stop breathing. A basket of fresh bread lay scattered across the ground, warm loaves rolling through the dirt while a young woman hurried to gather them with trembling hands. Sarah never looked up. She simply apologized over and over, even though everyone watching knew the accident hadn't been her fault. Standing above her with his polished boots untouched by the dust was Mr. Whitmore, the wealthiest merchant in town. His face was hard with irritation as he pointed a finger toward her. "Watch where you're going," he snapped loudly. "Girls like you should learn their place before wasting other people's time." A few people lowered their eyes, others simply pretended not to hear, no one stepped forward, no one offered to help. Then a calm voice broke the silence. "That's no way to treat a lady." Every head turned. Caleb stood only a few steps away, his hat casting a shadow across his face, his expression steady and unshaken. He wasn't a man known for raising his voice, and perhaps that was why the words carried so much weight. Mr. Whitmore let out a dry laugh and folded his arms. "You planning to fight me over a bakery girl?" he asked with a smirk. Caleb never moved. "I'm standing up for what's right." The merchant stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head in disgust. "You'll learn that kindness doesn't get a man very far," he muttered before walking away, leaving the crowd to slowly scatter as though nothing had happened. Sarah gathered the last loaf into her basket and finally looked up at Caleb. Her cheeks were flushed with embarrassment. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." Caleb bent down, brushed the dust from one of the loaves, and placed it gently back into her basket. "Maybe not," he replied. "But someone should have." She forced a faint smile. "I'm fine." The words were quiet, practiced, almost automatic, but Caleb knew they weren't true. As she reached for the basket, her sleeve slipped back just enough for him to notice dark bruises circling her wrist. He didn't ask where they came from. He simply noticed them. Years of carrying his own grief had taught him that some wounds weren't ready for questions. The next morning, Caleb rode into town before sunrise and stopped at Mrs. Dawson's bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted into the cool morning air as Sarah arranged warm loaves across the shelves. She looked surprised to see him. "What can I get for you?" she asked politely. "The usual," Caleb answered. She wrapped a loaf in brown paper and handed it over. The following morning, he returned. Then the morning after that. Soon it became routine. The ranch hands joked that Caleb must be eating enough bread to feed an army. Only he knew the truth. He wasn't coming for the bread. He was coming because he wanted Sarah to know that someone noticed when she was there, and perhaps more importantly, someone would notice if she wasn't. The town noticed too. Some admired Caleb's quiet kindness. Others warned him to stay out of matters that weren't his concern. One afternoon, while Sarah carried another tray into the front shop, Mrs. Dawson quietly stepped beside Caleb. "She's been treated that way for years," the older woman said softly. "No matter what folks say to her, she never answers back." Caleb looked through the bakery window as Sarah greeted another customer with the same gentle smile she offered everyone. "Why?" he asked. Mrs. Dawson sighed. "I think she learned a long time ago that staying quiet feels safer than speaking." Those words settled heavily in Caleb's heart because he understood them all too well. After losing his wife, he'd spent months hiding inside his own silence, believing that saying less somehow hurt less. Looking at Sarah now, he recognized the same loneliness behind her eyes. That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the prairie and the streets emptied, Caleb rode home along the edge of town. Just before reaching the last crossroads, something caught his attention. Sarah stood beside an old wagon waiting beneath a cottonwood tree. Without hesitation, she reached into the small pouch holding her wages and handed nearly every coin she had earned that week to the man sitting inside. When the wagon rolled away, Sarah counted the few coins left in her hand. It wasn't enough to buy much of anything. Yet she tucked them into her apron, lifted her empty basket, and quietly began the long walk home. The next morning, Caleb returned to Mrs. Dawson's bakery just as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the streets of Willow Creek. Sarah was already there, dusting flour from the countertop as fresh loaves cooled on wooden racks. The sweet aroma of warm bread drifted through the open windows, drawing in early customers. She looked up as the bell above the door chimed, and for the first time since they had met, the faintest smile crossed her face. It was small, almost hesitant, but Caleb noticed it immediately. He bought his usual loaf, exchanged a few quiet words, tipped his hat, and rode away. The following day, he came back again. Soon, his visits became part of the bakery's daily rhythm. Sometimes he bought bread. Sometimes he only stopped by to ask Mrs. Dawson if she needed help unloading sacks of flour or carrying heavy crates into the storeroom. Before anyone else arrived, he quietly repaired the loose wooden steps leading to the bakery porch. On another morning, he stacked freshly chopped firewood beside the back door so Sarah would not have to carry it herself. He never mentioned any of it. He never waited for thanks. He simply saw work that needed doing and did it. Slowly, something began to change. The bakery felt different. Customers lingered a little longer, sharing stories over fresh coffee instead of rushing back to work. The ranch hands laughed more often as they tore apart warm biscuits before heading out to the fields. Even Mrs. Dawson noticed that Sarah hummed softly while kneading dough, something she had not done in years. Yet not everyone welcomed the change. Whenever Mr. Whitmore crossed paths with Sarah, his sharp tongue found her again. Still pretending to be useful, he sneered one afternoon as she swept flour from the front porch. Sarah lowered her eyes and continued sweeping. She never answered. She never gave him the satisfaction of seeing her anger. Later that day, Caleb found her arranging fresh bread in the display window. After a long silence, he asked gently, "Why do you let him speak to you like that?" Sarah paused for a moment before looking out toward the empty street. "Some people think kindness is weakness," she said quietly. "I've learned it's easier to let them believe that." She offered no further explanation, and Caleb respected the silence between them. As the weeks passed, another mystery began to unfold. Every Sunday afternoon, after the bakery closed, Sarah packed a basket with bread, vegetables, and whatever food she could spare before leaving town alone. She always followed the same narrow trail beyond the last fence line and returned just before sunset carrying an empty basket. The ranch hands noticed. They guessed she might be visiting family, or perhaps delivering food to someone in need, but no one truly knew. Caleb found himself thinking about it more than he expected. Finally, one quiet Sunday, he kept his distance and followed her across the rolling prairie, through a grove of cottonwood trees, and beyond a shallow creek where few people ever traveled. Hidden among the trees stood a weathered little cabin. Sarah stepped inside without knocking. Caleb waited silently behind the trees. Then the door opened just enough for him to see that she wasn't alone. Caleb remained hidden beneath the shade of the cottonwood trees, careful not to disturb the quiet scene unfolding before him. Through the small cabin window, he saw Sarah gently place her basket on a worn wooden table before kneeling beside an elderly man resting in a handmade rocking chair. His hair had turned completely white, and his once powerful hands, scarred from decades of honest labor, now trembled as he reached for hers. Though age and illness had weakened his body, there was still dignity in the way he carried himself. Caleb recognized him almost immediately. Years ago, the entire county had known Thomas Carter as the finest blacksmith for miles around. Farmers trusted him with their plows, ranchers brought him broken horseshoes, and fathers proudly introduced their sons to the man whose craftsmanship had helped build half the valley. Now, forgotten by nearly everyone, he could barely rise from his chair without help. Sarah smiled as though she had stepped into a completely different world. She poured warm stew into a bowl, sliced fresh bread, and carefully set everything before her father before serving herself a much smaller portion. "You should eat first," Thomas said softly, noticing she had once again given him the larger meal. Sarah simply shook her head with a gentle smile. "You know I always make enough for both of us," she replied. The old man looked at her with quiet pride, but Caleb noticed the truth. She had not made enough for two. She had simply chosen to go without, just as she had done countless times before. After supper, Sarah helped her father take his medicine, added another log to the fireplace, folded clean blankets across his bed, and carefully patched a tear in his old coat before sweeping the tiny cabin floor. She moved from one task to another without a single complaint, not because anyone expected it, but because love had become the rhythm of her life. Caleb watched in silence, feeling something shift inside him. At last, he quietly turned his horse and rode away before Sarah could ever know he had been there. The following afternoon, he stopped by the bakery as usual. Mrs. Dawson noticed the thoughtful look on his face before he spoke a single word. After the morning customers had left, she quietly wiped flour from her hands and leaned against the counter. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked. Caleb nodded. Mrs. Dawson sighed deeply before looking toward Sarah, who was kneading dough in the back room. "She could have left this town years ago," the older woman said. "Folks from the city offered her good jobs. Better pay. Easier work. But she refused every one of them." Caleb remained silent. Mrs. Dawson continued. "Her father gave everything he had to this town. When he got sick, people visited for a while. Then life moved on. Sarah stayed because she believed family isn't something you leave behind when it becomes difficult." Those words settled heavily in Caleb's heart. For weeks he had mistaken Sarah's quietness for fear. Now he understood it had never been fear at all. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was sacrifice. Every insult she endured, every extra hour she worked, every coin she earned had been quietly poured into keeping her father alive. She wasn't living for herself. She was carrying someone else through life without ever asking the world to notice. Caleb made a decision that very afternoon. He would not embarrass Sarah by confronting her or offering charity she would likely refuse. Instead, before sunrise the next morning, a neatly stacked pile of seasoned firewood appeared beside the old cabin. 2 days later, fresh medicine arrived on the porch, already paid for. A sack of coal followed the next week. Then flour. Fresh vegetables. Smoked meat from Caleb's own ranch. No notes. No signatures. No explanation. Thomas often smiled as he carried the supplies inside, quietly wondering which neighbor God had sent to help them, while Sarah simply bowed her head in silent gratitude, never knowing who had made the deliveries. As autumn settled over Willow Creek, colorful banners began appearing across the town square. Children practiced songs outside the church, merchants decorated storefronts, and ranchers prepared wagons for the annual Founders Festival, the biggest celebration of the year. Everyone talked about the gathering with excitement. Everyone except Sarah. One evening, while helping Mrs. Dawson clean the bakery after closing, Sarah quietly folded her apron and said, almost in passing, "I won't be attending the festival this year." Mrs. Dawson looked up in surprise. "You never do," she said gently. Sarah only smiled, but there was sadness behind it. Outside the bakery window, Caleb happened to overhear those words. And for the first time, He found himself wondering what painful memory could keep someone with such a generous heart from joining the one celebration meant to bring the whole town together. The morning of the Founders' Festival arrived wrapped in golden sunlight, and for the first time in months, Willow Creek felt alive from one end of town to the other. Colorful banners stretched between buildings, children chased one another through the dusty streets, and the smell of roasted corn, fresh pies, and slow-cooked barbecue drifted through the crisp autumn air. Ranchers laughed together beside decorated wagons while musicians tuned their fiddles near the town square. It was the one day each year when old disagreements were forgotten, neighbors became friends again, and the entire community celebrated the people who had built the town with their own hands. Yet, despite the cheerful atmosphere, one familiar face was missing. Sarah had quietly decided to spend the day caring for her father instead of joining the celebration, believing she belonged where she was needed most. Mrs. Dawson eventually convinced her to stop by, if only for a few minutes, promising that everyone would be glad to see her. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed, keeping to the edge of the crowd, hoping to slip in and out without drawing attention. Then everything changed in an instant. A loud crack echoed across the square as the hitch securing a powerful draft horse suddenly snapped loose. Startled by the music and shouting, the frightened animal reared onto its hind legs before bolting through the crowded street. Tables overturned. People screamed. Parents grabbed their children and ran for safety. The sheriff shouted for everyone to clear the road, but panic spread faster than anyone could react. In the middle of the chaos stood a little girl, frozen with fear, unable to move as the terrified horse charged straight toward her. For one breathless moment, no one reached her. Then Sarah did. Without hesitation, she sprinted into the street, her heart pounding but her movements calm and certain. She scooped the little girl into her arms just as the horse thundered past, shielding the child before gently setting her behind a nearby wagon. Instead of running away, Sarah turned back toward the frightened animal. The horse continued circling wildly, its eyes wide with panic rather than anger. Sarah slowly stepped forward, speaking in the same gentle voice her father had once used inside his blacksmith shop whenever nervous horses arrived for new shoes. "It's all right," she whispered. "Easy now, easy." The horse recognized the calm in her voice. Its breathing slowly steadied. Its frantic steps became slower. Within moments, Sarah rested a gentle hand against its neck, soothing the frightened animal until it stood completely still. The entire town watched in stunned silence. Even Mr. Whitmore, who had mocked her so many times, could do nothing but stare. Beside the bakery, Mrs. Dawson wiped away tears and quietly said, "That girl has been saving people her whole life. We just never stopped long enough to notice." Those words settled over the crowd like a gentle wind. People suddenly remembered every quiet kindness Sarah had shown, every smile she had offered without expecting one in return, every sacrifice she had hidden behind her silence. They realized they had never truly known her. They had only believed the stories others chose to tell. Sheriff Collins stepped forward and removed his hat. "Sarah Carter," he said loudly enough for the entire square to hear, "on behalf of this town, thank you." One by one, the townspeople began clapping. The applause grew louder. Children smiled at her. Ranch hands tipped their hats. Even strangers joined in. For the first time in years, Sarah wasn't invisible. She wasn't the quiet bakery girl standing in someone else's shadow. She was the woman the whole town finally saw. As the applause slowly faded, another silence took its place. Mr. Whitmore lowered his eyes. Then, with every person watching, he slowly began walking toward Sarah. The crowd remained completely still as Mr. Whitmore stopped a few feet in front of Sarah. Only moments earlier, he had been the loudest voice willing to embarrass her in public. Now, with the entire town watching, he slowly removed his hat and lowered his head. Pride had finally given way to humility. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the silent square. "I judged you without ever knowing your story. I mistook your kindness for weakness, and I was wrong. For a long moment, Sarah simply looked at him. No anger crossed her face. No desire to make him feel the shame he had caused her. Then, with the same quiet grace she had shown every person she had ever helped, she offered a gentle smile. I forgive you, she replied softly. The words were simple, yet they carried more strength than any argument ever could. Caleb watched from a distance, realizing that forgiveness often demanded far more courage than revenge. As evening settled over Willow Creek, Caleb stopped by the little cabin beyond the creek. Sarah's father was resting comfortably beside the fireplace when Caleb stepped inside. The old blacksmith smiled knowingly before saying, I hoped someone would finally see my daughter the way I always have. Caleb looked toward the family photographs resting on the shelf and answered with quiet honesty. The whole town sees her now. The old man's eyes filled with grateful tears as he nodded. Later that night, Caleb walked Sarah home beneath a sky filled with stars. The festival music had faded into the distance, leaving only the gentle sound of crickets and the slow rhythm of their footsteps along the quiet road. After several moments of silence, Sarah finally looked toward him. Why did you stand up for me that day? She asked. Caleb smiled without taking his eyes off the road ahead. Because no woman should ever have to wonder if she's worth defending. Sarah stopped walking. Tears quietly filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from hearing words she had needed her entire life. Slowly, she reached for his hand. Caleb gently held it, and as they continued walking beneath the moonlit sky, neither of them let go. Months passed, and the quiet changes Caleb had hoped for slowly became part of everyday life. Sarah's father regained his strength little by little, returning to his forge whenever he could, while the bakery became one of the warmest places in town, filled with laughter instead of silence. People greeted one another more kindly, neighbors checked on those who lived alone, and children often retold the story of the cowboy who refused to stay silent when someone was being treated unfairly. Caleb and Sarah became inseparable, not because of grand declarations, but because of countless small acts of kindness shared day after day. Then, one afternoon, a young traveler stumbled in the middle of the street, spilling her basket across the dusty road. Before she could kneel to gather her belongings, 3 townspeople rushed forward to help. No one laughed. No one walked away. Caleb looked toward Sarah, and she met his eyes with a quiet smile. They both understood without speaking. The town had learned something far greater than good manners, it had learned compassion. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Because respect isn't measured by how we treat the powerful. It's revealed by how we treat those who have nothing to offer us in return. Sometimes, all it takes to change an entire town, is one person willing to stand up and say, that's no way to treat a lady.